It's hard for people to stay awake and aware to the incessant lying all around them. Be it governments, state institutions, the mainstream media, an intravenous drip is pumping dishonesty and distraction straight into the blood supplies of their captive peoples. Those nominally in authority lie. And part of the duty, perhaps the most important part of living in a democracy, is to remain constantly sceptical towards what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. describes as any aggregation of power. Trusting the experts, he says, is not something you do in a democracy. It's not a feature of democracy or science. It's a feature of religion and totalitarianism. It's everywhere, both the lying by the totalitarians and the evidence of our need for constant scepticism. Every time United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer opens his mouth, I'm primed for insincerity and doublespeak at the very least. A TV drama that's been all the rage recently is Adolescence, about a white teenage boy so radicalised by misogyny online that he stabs a girl. Starmer was on his hind legs in Parliament to rave about it, talking about the need to tackle the emerging and growing problem. What problem, exactly? A growing problem of working class white boys stabbing people. That's a new one on me. I'm pretty sure that if white working class boys were running around stabbing their classmates, we'd never hear the end of it. Knowsley Labour MP Annalise Midgley echoed Starmer's excitement about the apparent issue, saying the show highlights online male radicalisation and violence against girls. An epidemic of white boys stabbing their peers is not a thing in the UK. But as they say, why let the facts get in the way of a good story? When it comes to challenging authority figures, or perhaps authoritarian figures, heed again those words of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about constant scepticism, the warning that trusting experts is a feature not of democracy, but of religion and totalitarianism. Official claims to be sceptical about, are everywhere. 5 years and more after the start of the COVID hoax, the hoax that curtailed our freedom, saw the greatest transfer of wealth from poor to rich in human history, and billions of people, children and babies included, injected with dangerous products. The New York Times, infamous serial purveyor of state-drafted dishonesty and misdirection, just carried a comment piece headlined, "We were badly misled about the event that changed our lives." Oh, do you think so, New York Times? I could save you the labour of reading the doggerel by saying it's been carefully crafted to insist that responsible people everywhere must continue to stand ready to do what they're told. From the point of view of the New York Times, we can't let such a thing as having been badly misled stop us doing the right thing, which is to live in fear of the next pandemic. And so we read, quote, "In 2020, when people started speculating that a laboratory accident might have been the spark that started the COVID-19 pandemic, they were treated like kooks and cranks. Many public health officials and prominent scientists dismissed the idea as a conspiracy theory, insisting that the virus had emerged from animals in a seafood market in Wuhan, China. We have since learned, however, that to promote the appearance of consensus, some officials and scientists hid or understated crucial facts, misled at least one reporter, orchestrated campaigns of supposedly independent voices, and even compared notes about how to hide their communications in order to keep the public from hearing the whole story. And as for that Wuhan laboratory's research, the details that have since emerged show that safety precautions might have been terrifyingly lax." But the dutiful New York Times is at pains to remind us, quote, "The next pandemic is only an accident away. Run for your lives." Here's an especially good bit. Quote, "It's not hard to imagine how the attempt to squelch legitimate debate might have started. Some of the loudest proponents of the lab leak theory weren't just earnestly making inquiries. Oh no, says the New York Times, wagging its finger in our faces. Quote, They were acting in terrible faith. Terrible people, those skeptics. Quote, using the debate over pandemic origins to attack legitimate beneficial science, to inflame public opinion, to get attention. For scientists and public health officials, circling the wagons and vilifying anyone who dared to dissent might have seemed like a reasonable defence strategy. So what if honest people were ruined? But let's read on. Quote, that's also why it might be tempting for those officials or the organisations they represent to avoid looking too closely at mistakes they made, at the ways that while trying to do such a hard job, they might have withheld relevant information and even misled the public. Such self-scrutiny is especially uncomfortable now, as an unvaccinated child has died of measles. Open brackets, I suggest. How many vaccinated people have died of so-called vaccines? Close brackets, and back to the New York Times. Quote, anti-vaccine nonsense is being pumped out by the top of the federal government. They mean Robert F. Kennedy Jr., of course, but stay with me. But a clumsy, misguided effort like this didn't just fail, it backfired. These half-truths and strategic deceptions made it easier for people with the worst motives to appear trustworthy while discrediting important institutions where many earnestly labour in the public interest. We may not know exactly how the COVID pandemic started, but if research activities were involved, that would mean 2 out of the last 4 or 5 pandemics were caused by our own scientific mishaps. Let's not make a third. Close brackets, closed quotes. See how it's done? Implicit in the whole New York Times piece is that out there right now are many, many labs filled with good, hard-working scientists labouring night and day to protect us from harm, and that from time to time, we should know, some overworked soul might trip and spill something. I've said over and over that the lab leak line is a red herring at best. I don't believe there was any new disease from a lab or anywhere else. Flu deaths stopped at the end of 2019, disappeared entirely, and were replaced by deaths from what we were told was COVID-19. Convenient much. Government data from Germany showed that in 2019 and 2020, hospital bed occupancy there was at a record low, and that physicians and clinicians reported no evidence whatsoever of the presence of a novel infection of any kind. Average age at death from so-called COVID was 82. What sort of vaccine is it that the world's governments and their supine mainstream media had to bully, bribe and terrify their own people into taking it? What sort of disease is it when you don't even know you've got it unless you take a dodgy test? A test never intended for such a use. To keep the numbers constantly rising, any death within 28 days of a positive test, even falling off a cliff or getting hit by a bus, was listed as a COVID death. What matters about what they called COVID is not what it was, if it even existed, but what was done to us in its name by those we're supposed to trust. This effort, 5 years later, not just in the New York Times, but all around, the cynical conduct of the so-called COVID inquiries that are no more than whitewashes. This effort after the fact is only to perpetuate the myth there was something, anything to fear. If you accept COVID was a real disease that escaped from a lab, where otherwise well-meaning and dedicated scientists were only doing their best to prepare to save us from inevitable pandemics, if you accept that central premise, then you are being nudged to accept that something had to be done by our governments, and that in the end, whatever they did, however many were damaged or destroyed along the way, those authorities were only doing their best. Lies. Accept that much hokum, and the hook is embedded in your throat, ready to haul you into the next hoax, the next pandemic, climate crisis, the next war to protect democracy. Accept all that and you excuse the fact that billions of people were injected with a so-called vaccine that wasn't a vaccine, but a gene therapy, often contaminated with DNA. Accept all that, and in so doing, you excuse those responsible for a medical intervention all but mandated that killed or damaged millions of people on the grounds that something deadly and new was out there and we had to do something, and that something we did was only our best. What COVID was doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter if there was any such thing. What matters is what was done, why it was done. When someone's shot dead, the people running around the corpse are not in the main asking, who made the bullet? What was the bullet made of? If they've any sense at all, they're asking, who did it? What was the motive for the murder? Who is better off now that that person is dead? And speaking of someone being shot dead, and too many stupid questions and even stupider answers about a magic bullet, let's talk about the release, so-called, of the files relating to the murder of President John F. Kennedy. 62 years after the murder of the US president, some 80,000 odd documents have been made public. Already, the mainstream media is falling over itself to insist there's nothing to see here, nothing new. The unsinkable nonsense and lies about a lone shooter called Lee Harvey Oswald committing the crime all by himself is still standing after all this time.
Still no evidence to suggest that there was anyone other than Oswald being the lone shooter.
And yet, all the while, we are fed the old Kool-Aid of the lone shooter. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is out there alleging something altogether different.
It was a group from the CIA, and my uncle, 30 days before his death, on October 22nd, 1963, he signed Executive Order 263, ordering all U.S. troops home from Vietnam. So he ended the Vietnam War. With the first 1,000 coming home in December, there was only 16,000 troops and their advisors. They weren't allowed to participate in combat. He found out they had been, and 75 had died. And he said that morning, he said, no more, we're done. And he ordered them all home. And 30 days after that, he was killed. Vietnam was a CIA project, from beginning to end. So there were people in the agency, and we know who they were. It was David Hadley Phillips. It was Bill Harvey. It was E. Howard Hunt. It was Alan Dulles. It was James Jesus Angleton. We know the shooters. They were, 3 men from who had been in Batista's battalions in Cuba, and who later, died under different circumstances. One of them died in a prison in Cuba, imprisoned by Castro. But you asked me what I think. What I would say is I'm an attorney. I've tried hundreds of cases. I was a district attorney. If I had to prove my case that the CIA murdered my uncle, I'm very confident, just on the evidence that is out there now, that would be very, very easy to prove in front of any jury in America.
Skepticism is so vital, so useful. It was in part to cover up the killing, to silence and ridicule legitimate questions, that the CIA coined the term conspiracy theory, as well as contemplating the dreadful reality that COVID itself was a hoax, a false flag cynically deployed to permit the removal of our freedoms and the theft of our wealth and our pollution with a gene therapy. As well as thinking about that, the release of the John F. Kennedy files should have us contemplate why now and for whose benefit. The lab leak story is the get-out-of-jail-free card for all those that colluded and connived to push the pandemic lie. It provides the convenient excuse for all that was done by all those just doing their best. And now, the dump of tens of thousands of documents about the JFK killing, some of them still redacted, some of them still withheld on some or other legal grounds. Now, that reveal seeks to do the opposite of what so many people hoped. Now it becomes no more than another part of the authorities seeking to perpetuate the Lee Harvey Oswald lone shooter myth. What Americans should be asking especially given the allegations made by the nephew of a murdered president, son of a murdered presidential candidate, is what if? Because if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is right, and the CIA were at least involved in the assassination of JFK in 1963, then since that day, the USA, the United States of America, has been the product of a coup. Since that day, every US administration that perpetuated the cover-up of the killing would have to be regarded as illegitimate. Surely such a possibility is at least worth pausing to consider. If Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and a host of others are correct, then every president from that day to this has been nothing more than a willing, or at best unknowing, factotum of those who completed a coup and covered it up. I say we're living in a world of lies, a world in which we are conditioned from cradle to grave to swallow lies. Ask yourself too about consequences, or rather the lack thereof. On account of lies on top of lies, lies to cover up lies, there have been and will be no consequences, none whatever, for all the harms done in the name of COVID. On account of so many years having passed, 62 years since the JFK murder, there can be no consequences for the guilty, dead now and safe from retribution. We've all heard the line about the world balancing on an infinite tower of turtles. I say not. I say that rather than turtles, it's lies. Lies and lies and lies. All the way down.